Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. The culture is shifting, but transgenderism remains a divisive issue even among some Christians. Today we'll go back in time to 2020 when I went one-on-one with Professor Nancy Pearcey, the author of the powerful book Love Thy Body, answering hard questions about life and sexuality. Professor Pearcey shares her research and advice to parents of transgender kids on how to navigate the medical minefield and help their children. But before we dive in, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And remember, if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org. Now let's jump into the conversation. We are live with Professor Nancy Pearcey out of Houston Baptist University and many other places where she speaks and teaches, and she's a prolific writer of some very good books. Matter of fact, the book we're going to look at today is her book called Love Thy Body, and I've used that in the past in my ethics course, and students, I'll tell you, Nancy, have had a great response to it. Most everybody has really loved it. It was one of their favorite books that I used in my class. I've had a few students question thoughts here or there and have a few discussions come up, but it's been really well received with my students. So it's a great book for folks to pick up. So thanks for joining me to discuss that too today.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm glad to hear that you've been using it in your classroom. You
know, the neat part about it, and folks maybe will see this in discussions today, is that, you know, the other two textbooks I had for my ethics class covered a lot of issues, but yours really broaches an issue of gender identity and gender ethics that aren't covered in some of the existing other materials, at least not to the depth. And I think it's such an important issue because so many are really confused by this topic, or it's just such a dominant theme in the culture that it needs a larger treatment like in your book. So it was a great to get that in, because I was addressing a lot of the issues you addressed in my coursework, but it really gave a good supplement to it. What I want to talk about today is help Christians understand why transgenderism specifically is not really compatible with a biblical ethic. But I'm also really hoping to touch on some advice, some ideas for parents on how to talk to their kids when they're dealing with this topic, whether their kids are the ones facing it or just maybe just parents trying to help their kids understand what they're seeing on TV and what they're hearing in classrooms, even as young as kindergarten age. So this is a really critical topic for that. So that said, a lot of folks hear what I just said, the idea that transgenderism isn't really compatible with a biblical ethic, and they immediately assume that I'm motivated by hate of some kind. And I'm sure you've run across that when you've spoken on this topic in many places. Can you talk about that perception or speak to it and explain sort of in your own words why the Christian position is really one of love and compassion and not hate?
Yeah, in fact, it's the opposite. It's the other way around. The irony is that the transgender ideology actually assumes a very low view of the body, of the who we are and our physical characteristics. Mm-hmm. Think of it this way. Even the transgender activists themselves say that the assumption that they're making is that your gender identity has nothing to do with your biological sex. That's their basic message. Who you are in terms of your biological sex, male or female, has nothing to do with your authentic self. Well, what are they saying then? They're saying that your biological self has no value, dignity, tells you nothing about who you are, has no moral message, has no intrinsic purpose that you're morally obligated to respect. So in essence, what it's saying is your body is meaningless and purposeless, and you have no reason to take into account when you're trying to figure out who you are. And the irony of this is that even secular people are starting to see this. When I wrote Love Thy Body, which was 2 years ago now, nobody was saying it yet. But now you'll even see secular organizations saying transgenderism promotes body hatred.
So you are seeing some shift in the dialogue about that now, 2 years later. That's interesting to note that.
Exactly. There was an interview that came out after Love Thy Body was already out, but an interview with a 14-year-old girl who had lived as a trans boy for 3 years, from age 11 to age 14. She had lived as a boy. And then she reclaimed her identity as a girl. And she said in this interview, the turning point came when I realized, and this is a direct quote, it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body.
Hmm.
And I thought,
Wow.
that would have been great for my book,
Yeah.
How to Love Thy Body. But here was a secular teenager saying the solution to transgenderism is to learn to love your body. And in the same interview, she also used that term, body hatred, that transgenderism expresses a rejection or even hatred of your body. So yes, I do see some movement here among secular people figuring this out. That, well, I'll give you another example. This was a girl who had, she lived as a transgender. She started, I think, at about age 19, so she was a little older, and she lived as a transgender person, as a male, for 5 years. And she has a blog, so she was writing about it. And she said, when I came out as a boy, I was celebrated. You know, people talk about transgender people as being a vulnerable population. No, they're celebrated. They get a parade. In the public schools, you come out as trans, you get a parade, you get praise, you get told how authentic and courageous you are. And this woman said, here's how she put it. She said, the boy me got a lot more affirmation than the girl me had ever gotten before. And then when she detransitioned, it was the opposite. She got castigated, she got criticized, she got rejected by all of her former friends. And then here's what she wrote. She said, if I had one message for girls who think they're trans, she said, if I could persuade just one girl to love her body, if I could persuade just one girl to love her body, then all the rejection and criticism I've gone through would be worth it. Wow. So there's another case. Wow. Somebody who's been there recognizes that the issue here is that it's not that Christianity has a low view or critical view or hatred. It's the transgender view that's based on a hatred of the physical body.
Yeah. No, that's really good to know, and not just understand that, but to hear some of the stories of some of the changes taking place, even since you wrote this several years ago, that, those outside the Christian worldview are recognizing that trans movement has not demonstrated a value for the individual. It's almost like we value your what your experience insofar as we can use it politically to advance a cause or to gain power and stuff, but there's not necessarily a value for the individual as an individual. And I think that's critical that Christians not forget that. But even so, let me just ask you real quick, because you kind of defined it. And so I do want to say that folks listening in or hearing this may not fully understand what it even means to be transgender or what transgenderism is. So can you give like a real quick summary of what that means when we're saying transgenderism or transgender?
Right. So a transgender person is a person who feels uncomfortable in their body, in the sex of their body in particular. In other words, a girl who feels more boyish or a boy who feels more girlish. And to the point where they decide their real identity is the opposite sex. And there's really two forms of transgenderism now, though, which is important to recognize. True transgenderism usually shows up at a very young age. In other words, by the time they're toddlers, these kids are clearly uncomfortable with their gender and feeling like they identify more with the opposite sex.
Yeah.
In recent years, there's been a new kind of transgenderism, which is being called rapid onset transgender, rapid onset gender dysphoria, ROGD. Rapid onset gender dysphoria. And this is what's actually the more puzzling case, because these are kids, and I should say mostly girls in terms of numbers, who seemed to be fine when they were growing up, who seemed to be very comfortable being a girl, were never, they were not particularly tomboyish. They were girly girls. And then at sometime in adolescence and teens, they suddenly decide they're really a boy. And so there's been one study specifically on rapid onset gender dysphoria. And it's quite different. And it seems much more likely to be a product of social contagion, kids getting on the internet and finding out, so many of the young people who transitioned make videos, and so you can find hundreds, thousands of videos now saying, "Oh, I found my true self, and I'm so happy now that I'm on testosterone. I'm finding my true self, or now that I've had top surgery, look, I'm becoming a boy." And so it's very easy for a young person to think, "Oh, well, maybe that is the answer to my problems," because every teenager has some anxiety and depression. Yeah. And so when they see this now put on the internet as something that's going to maybe be the magic bullet that solves all their problems, rapid onset gender dysphoria seems to be at least partly influenced by social contagion.
Yeah, and I think that what you're bringing out is super important for people to understand. It's the word transgender or transgenderism is used, but it covers a very broad spectrum of beliefs and practices that each kind of have to be sort of evaluated for what they are, not like just lumped together. Because a lot of people, because they're more concerned with the political side of it, just lump it all together because they have an agenda, but they're not really actually concerned about the individuals. And you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think from what I've read and some of the research I've done, psychologists are concerned about this rapid onset gender dysphoria and try not to confuse it with usually what happens at a younger age, the transgenderism and the psychological kind of issues that come with younger kids. And I've heard more, at least I've read some people that are a little more concerned about this rapid onset gender. They'll validate the others, say, "Oh, this is legitimate," that they don't have any concerns about any of that at the younger age in terms of they believe that's a legitimate state, but they do have concerns about this later in teen years kind of rapid onset gender dysphoria. Is that pretty fair to say that there's that distinction is in a lot of the literature, or is it very few people making that, do you think?
Rapid onset gender dysphoria is happening so rapidly that it is gaining more attention. When I give my lecture on this subject, I have some charts, and you can see the number of teenage girls and boys, but the girls are much more dramatic. You can see on the chart, and these were charts from America, Britain, Sweden, and Holland, I think. Anyway, I had 4 charts from 4 Western countries, and the number of teenagers who identify as transgender was, fairly even, and then suddenly it goes like this. And it's very dramatic. In England, I think in the last 10 years, it's gone up something like 400%.
Oh my goodness!
Last time I heard. Yeah, so you will find a lot of the literature now is geared towards that phenomenon because that's happening so rapidly, and people are trying to make sense of it. True gender dysphoria, of course, is very rare. The kind that starts when you're a child. It's very rare. So you're right. It's not getting as much attention right now. And there's the best known study on rapid onset gender dysphoria was by Lisa Littman. It's Littman. She's at Brown University. Okay. Check my notes here. She's at Brown, and she found that. Here's what I thought was the most interesting thing that she discovered. 63% of the girls who claimed rapid onset gender dysphoria already had some other diagnosed psychological issue. In other words, most teens have some depression and anxiety and so on. But these were kids who were bad enough that their parents had actually brought them to a therapist, and they had already been diagnosed with things like autism, anxiety, depression, ADHD. And by the way, autism was the most common. Autism has been reliably associated with gender dysphoria for a long time, and nobody's really quite sure why. But so these were kids who were already diagnosed before they came out as transgender. So what that means is these are very troubled kids. We need to be giving them help. They really need to be having therapy and care. And what's happening instead is that most of them are being transitioned. If they go to a gender clinic, they're immediately transitioned. I had a chance to do an article where I interviewed several parents of transgender kids, and they all turned out to be girls, and they all turned out to be rapid onset gender dysphoria, as opposed to from childhood. And I got really heartrending stories from parents who said things like, be prepared to be treated as the enemy by your own child. Because the gender clinics and schools are basically saying if you don't immediately get on board, then you're a toxic parent.
Yeah, and I want to get to that a little bit later too, and talk about that, how parents respond, because I think that issue is very critical. And I even read the other day that in the UK they're making some moves to maybe limit or outlaw some of the transgender transition surgeries, because I think they've seen some negatives to that they're kind of putting a little bit of a pause button at least. So I think you're right. I think there's some changes happening with this, and it's important for Christians to be in a position where we're looking at a biblical worldview and not letting just the populist sentiment of culture determine what compassion and love really is. And I think you do a good job actually in chapter 6 of your book, kind of helping distinguish between some of those common misconceptions of what transgenderism really is. First, maybe you can explain to people, how is transgenderism different than the issue of, say, homosexuality or sexual orientation?
Well, you know what? It's different, and at the same time, one of my goals in Love Thy Body is to show that the underlying worldview is actually the same.
Yes.
Very similar. Sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. If you're attracted to the same sex or the opposite sex. Transgenderism is if you identify with the opposite sex from what your biological sex is. But you'll notice that both of them involve a rejection of your biology, of your body. Males and females it's biologically based, right? That's how the human sexual and reproductive system is designed.
Yeah.
That males are oriented toward females, females towards males. So if you embrace a same-sex identity, what you're essentially saying is, why should my body influence my moral choices? Why should my body, my biological sex as male or female, have any role in my decision about how I'm going to behave, how I'm going to act, how I'm going to identify in terms of my sexual orientation? It's also saying, why should I care about my body, just as transgenderism does?
Yeah.
Now, transgenderism is different because people are taking puberty blockers and hormones and surgery, so it's much more disruptive to the individual. But the underlying worldview of rejection of the body is actually the same. And this comes out. You may remember this quote. This is one of my favorite quotes from my book Love Thy Body, and it was by an outspoken lesbian, Camille Paglia. And some Christians read her stuff because she's a bit of an iconoclast. And one way she's an iconoclast, by the way, is she does not accept the postmodern view that sex is just a social construction. She says, no, nature made us male and female. Humans are a sexually reproducing species. So how does she then get around that to support her and defend her lesbianism? What she says is, why should we be limited by nature? And here's her exact words. She says, why not defy nature? Why not defy nature? After all, and this is a direct quote, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. So essentially, that's in a nutshell, the philosophical underpinnings of homosexuality. What she's saying is, if our bodies are products of blind material forces, Darwinian evolution, if we're the product of mindless, purposeless forces, then our bodies have no intrinsic purpose that we're morally obligated to respect. And our bodies give us no moral message. They tell us nothing about who we are. We may do with them as we see fit.
Yeah.
So again, that kind of captures the notion that if you see the body as a purposeless product of random forces, why should you respect your biological sex? Why not do whatever your feelings tell you to do? I mean, it is a logical position.
Yeah.
So the only way we can counter it is not by just saying you're wrong, you're sinful, it's against the Bible. What you need to do to counter it is to show that our bodies are not products of mindless, purposeless forces. That even biology itself shows that living things are structured for a purpose. On a simplest level, the eyes are made for seeing, ears are made for hearing, wings are made for flying and fins are made for swimming, and the development of the entire organism is directed by a built-in plan or blueprint. So science itself shows that living things are structured for a purpose. And so science underscores the Christian view, which is we are made by a mind, we are made for a purpose, and we are meant to ask what is that purpose and structure our lives by that. And we will ultimately be happier and healthier when we live according to the way we are made.
Yeah, what you're saying is so critical that I think people don't get. You know, those distinctions are important between what these different movements are, ideas that people have, whether it's being gay or lesbian or transgender. They're very different in their approach, but there is a worldview distinction that unites those things and makes them different from the Christian worldview. And that's exactly why they're not compatible, because as Christians, we'd say, as you said, we have purpose. There is design. We believe that God has created us for something very specific. And I used to tell my youth kids when I was a youth guy a long time ago that I thought one of the most destructive messages the world had is to tell you is you can be anything you want to be. And I said, because God hasn't created you to be, anything. He's created you to be something. There's a specific purpose and a design that God's given you. And so if you're 6'6", chances of you saying I want to be a fighter pilot are not very good. Because the cockpit doesn't allow for people that large. And so, the idea that tell people they can become anything or do anything and not honor what they're, how the God has made them to be, I think translates into that discussion of biological sex, and that there's a purpose behind that God has given us for who we are. And I think that does determine our ethics and our values and the way we live our lives. And so your point on that, I think, is so critical to understand for us. I think there's also a lot of parity. I think the transhumanist movement is another outflow of the same thinking of this, we can determine our own destiny. In the early 20th century, whenever race was such a big issue and eugenics was so bad, I think, race ended up becoming a social construct, and as to try to eliminate the Darwinian worldview of where it was leading people towards in terms of race. And I think now that just the next thing is, well, if race is a social construct, so is gender, so is sex, so is it, because nothing has purpose, nothing has design. It's all just what you want to make it to be. And we can overcome Darwin by just creating our own reality and our own future. And it's just all these things come together. It's not like they're in a vacuum. So I think that's pretty critical.
Yeah, and I like your reference to transhumanism, because the transhumanists are also saying, well, you know what they're saying? Martin Rothblatt is a leading transhumanist. And it's a he who lives as a woman. But he literally says transgenderism is the stepping stone to transhumanism, because as soon as we make gender a social construct, we can make humanity itself a social construct.
Exactly.
And so again, it's that split between mind and body. Why should we be limited by our bodies? And what's his name? Stephen Kurzweil, who's at Google. He literally says we're transcending biology. Why should we be limited by biology? So transhumanism is a great way to show where transgenderism is headed. It's headed towards a complete rejection of the body. And there's an article on it recently that said, this is really the Cartesian dualism. Cartesian meaning the 17th century philosopher Descartes, who was the first to propose a really radical mind-body dualism. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, that's what's behind all of these issues that deal with the body today, whether it's homosexuality, transgenderism, abortion, and euthanasia as well. All of them involve a rejection of the body. And by the way, here's where we should speak to our Christian audience and help them to realize if I get pushback from Christians, it's usually because they don't think Christians are supposed to have a high view of the body. They don't think Christians are supposed to be affirming the value, dignity, and significance of the human body, because they have accepted a sacred secular split that says we should only care about spiritual things. The earthly things are really not that important. And this is where we have to go back and say, well, we've lost touch with our own heritage. When the early church was born, it was born into a culture dominated by philosophies that rejected the material world.
Yeah.
Gnosticism, many people know about that because some of the New Testament is written against Gnosticism, but also Platonism and Manichaeism. Augustine was a Manichae. But all of these isms in the time of the early church rejected the material world as the world of death, decay, and destruction, and the source of evil. And so Plato actually called the body the prison of the soul, so that the goal of salvation was to escape from the body, escape from the material world, and reascend to the spiritual realm. And in this context, Christianity was nothing short of revolutionary, because the material world is good because it's the creation of a good God. And by the way, Gnosticism even taught that it was an evil God that created this world. Yeah. They had several levels of deity, and it was the lowest God who had created the material world, and he was actually an evil God because no good God would get his hands dirty mucking about with matter. So it was really revolutionary, really radical when Christians said, no, it was the supreme deity, who was a good God, who created this world.
Yeah.
And the real scandal, though, historically speaking, was the incarnation, because not only had a good God created the world, but the good God had entered into this realm of matter and taken on a physical body. And then when Jesus was executed on a Roman cross, we might say he did escape the physical realm, as Gnosticism taught we should aspire to do. But what did he do then? He came back in a physical body. Yeah. To the ancient Greeks, this was not spiritual progress. Who would want to come back to the body? Yeah. So Paul says, the idea of a physical resurrection was foolishness to the Greeks, as he puts it in 1 Corinthians. And then at the end of time, what is God going to do? He's not going to scrap the physical world as if he made a mistake the first time around. He's going to renew it and restore it, creating a new heavens and a new earth.
Yeah.
And we will be on that new earth in physically resurrected bodies. The Apostles' Creed, right from the beginning, affirmed the resurrection of the body.
Yeah.
This is an amazingly high view of the physical realm, and Christians need to understand what a great treasure we have here. There's no other religion or philosophy that teaches such a high view of the value and dignity of the physical realm. We should be so excited. We should be coming out to the secular culture with this positive message, and that we're so excited and we're so happy to share.
Yeah, what you're saying is so critical, because it goes back to that very place where I began. The secular world has framed this debate as hate or love. If you don't agree with us, it's because you're a hateful, bigoted human being. And what you're really underscoring here is that not only is our motivation for talking about transgenderism one of love and compassion, but it's one of knowing that there's a design and a purpose for us in eternity that God has made for us, and a view of reality and the value of material reality that is just undermined. And so if we don't value all of the material world and creation, we're talking about environmental issues. I mean, to care for the environment, to be caretakers of the environment. Why should we even care, if it all is going to transmorph into something else, or, I think you're really right to tie that big picture view in for Christians to get why this is so critical that we not make concessions to this political movement, really, because there is a value for the individual and a value for our eternal life with God and how the way He's created us that you're all tying together.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned environmentalism, because that's one of the things that surprised me when Love Thy Body came out, is that the argument that my secular friends found most persuasive, and a lot of Christians too, as I speak in churches and conferences, is based on environmentalism. Your first response would be, what does that have to do with transgenderism? But what we've learned from the environmental movement is that to avoid pollution and ecological disasters, we cannot do as we see fit with the environment. When Camille Paglia says, my body's mine and I can do what I see fit. We can't do that with the environment. We've discovered that you can't just barge in there. You have to work with the structure of nature. We need to work with the natural order. We can intervene, but when we do, we need to work with the natural order that's there. And in the same way, what Christians are saying is that we should respect our biological nature, that the correspondence between male and female is not some evolutionary accident. It's part of the original creation that God pronounced very good. And so when Love Thy Body first came out, a lot of the customer reviews on places like Amazon went like this. I picked up this book to learn handy answers to the secular issues, but what I found out is it's transforming me.
Yeah.
That I realized I didn't have a Christian worldview on things like, sex and body and nature.
Yeah.
And again, it's the environmental argument hits home for an awful lot of people. They've figured out we need to respect nature when it's nature. But what about respecting our own nature? That's what Christians are really saying.
Yeah. And that's actually a critical part of your book. That's why it actually was valuable in my class, because when I would teach my students, I'm saying, look, our Christian worldview is sort of almost like a worldview ethics kind of approach, as opposed to here's the right, wrong view, a prescriptive, very specific rule. There's a worldview approach to this. We have to understand how to see the world. And once we understand how to see the world, then we can apply the biblical truth that we're looking to very unique circumstances that the Bible just doesn't talk about. And I think your book gives that worldview perspective that a lot of other books, and it's fine that they don't have it. It's just, because there's a different focus, but it was a missing piece for a lot of students to see the broader issues that have to be taken into consideration. I'll give you one example because I think you've covered this. It was actually a question I was going to ask you, but I think you kind of addressed this. I don't know if you're familiar with the book Transgender 101 by Nicholas Tisch. Have you read that book?
I haven't seen that one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a really good book. But Tisch is born biologically female, but transitioned to male, is married and has a child. He considers himself an LGBTQ activist, has camps that he runs for transgender kids and for multiple camps that he runs. But he says in his book, in Transgender 101, he says, the movement itself is steeped in a postmodern denial of transcendent reality. He says, quote, there is not one universal answer. In other words, what's the problem with, how do we look at transgender? How do we look at LGBTQ answer? And he says, look, there's not one universal answer. In other words, we can't have an answer. It's like page 26 of his book. I'm going to write a whole book about answers, but I'm going to tell you there's not one answer to this. And he just has this clear denial of any sort of objective truth or reality, which also means that there's no objective moral standard by which we can deal with these gender identity issues or environmental issues either. I mean, it all falls together based on that worldview. So I think your book does a good job of addressing that.
If we don't deal with the worldview issues, then we come across as sort of arbitrary. Just don't do this, don't do that. And young people, that's not enough. They're looking for the reasons behind the rules.
Yes.
And it's the worldview that explains the reasons behind the rules and helps people to see that there's good reason for why God has said, do this, don't do that, because it fits with who we are. A couple of years ago, there's an article in a magazine. It was a magazine for homosexuals. And it dealt with homosexuals who had changed their minds. We talked at the beginning of the interview, we talked about a couple of transgender people who had detransitioned.
Yeah.
Well, this was an article on homosexuals who had come out as homosexual and then later were attracted to the opposite sex again. And so they were saying, well, what am I then? Because when they came out of the closet as, attracted to the same sex, they thought they had discovered their true authentic identity. And so they were shocked when later, some years later, they were attracted to heterosexual relationships again. And it was a psychotherapist writing the article, and he said, don't worry. The idea that you have one gender that's related to your sex, your biological sex, and it doesn't change, is a modernist idea. We're now transitioning to a postmodern idea that your gender has nothing to do with your biological sex, and therefore you can choose it, and if you choose it, you can also change it. Yeah. So that reminds me of the quote you just gave from the transgender book. There's nothing transcendent about who you are. You can choose it. You can change it. And that's really where young people are today. By the way, if you talk to older homosexuals, they're still in the modernist mentality. I've had a few talk to me on, especially my Facebook page, and they're like, "No, once I discover I'm gay or lesbian, that's who I am, and I can't change." Younger people, poof, gender is fluid.
Yeah.
You can change it any day. You can change it through the day. There was even an NPR program where they interviewed young people on gender, and they literally said, "I will go to one event as one gender and another event as the opposite gender." It can change even in the day.
Yeah.
So what did they say? So these teenagers, high school kids said, "I consider the sexual binary as an oppressive move by the dominant culture."
Yeah.
So to even believe that the binary is oppressive.
The academic literature is full of that stuff. I mean, it's interesting if folks read any of the books, and they may not catch this, but it's one of those words to look out for. A lot of it talks about the logics of sexuality, and it's plural, logics plural. And they make logics plural because they distinguish it from, say, the idea of Western civilization and Western logic was one system of logic, but it's meant to oppress. It's the patriarchy. It's gender biased. But they talk about a plurality of logics, and so within our logics system, we can allow for these things. So even the pluralization of a simple word like that, you realize they're not talking about there's no uniform way of looking at reality for them. And so they need to create a whole system of logics so that they can then write and sound academic and smart and all these other kind of things. It's really fascinating to read and see how the subtle play of those worldviews are forcing them. I think the real key is what I've noticed yesterday is Christians are winning the discussions on these. We're winning the debates on these things. But the problem is the goalposts keep shifting. And that's really the challenge. I've read now multiple articles on just the issue of abortion where multiple people are saying, look, yes, a baby is a human life from the moment of conception, but it doesn't matter. Well, because why? Well, because they've lost that argument that it's not a life, that it's pre-human, so they just changed the goalpost. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of these gender identity things is that Christians are actually we're doing a great job debating, and we're doing a great job thinking and intellectually. But the problem is, because we've done such a good job, the academics who are committed to these things, committed to their worldview, are looking for these ad hoc solutions to move the goalposts. And we have to teach our kids how to understand and respond to that. And that's why I want to move you into this last little part we have, if I can, because I want to get you and get your thoughts on how can parents deal with these sort of issues and helping our kids to look at these things or talk about these. So to do that, let me just do a quick article for you. It came from a place called The Post Millennial, and it's titled "Parents with Gender Dysphoria Kids Are Fighting Back to Get Your Feedback," something you talked about earlier. It says the author, Frances Mallory, writes, quote, "At an undisclosed location somewhere in North America, a small group of parents met for a secret meeting. When they arrived, they were warned not to use their real names or reveal where they had been from. Not that they weren't trusted. They had been thoroughly vetted beforehand. But if the real names or hometowns were not known, then no one could inadvertently let it slip." She goes on to say, and this was a group of parents with teenagers or young adult children who had suddenly decided they were transgender. That's what you were talking about earlier, the sudden onset transgender dysphoria. So the parents came from a wide range of religious and political leanings, but all were intelligent, well-educated, and strong-minded enough to ask questions when something sounded wrong, even if it was coming from a, quote, respected authority. They had all independently researched their children's issues, and each had arrived at the same conclusion: the experts were wrong. So this is where obviously you spent a lot of your work and you've studied. What do we do? Well, how do parents approach this topic? Is there some inroad to this that even begins? Where do we start as parents?
Well, I can't help but go back to what you were saying about logics
Sure.
plural. It's not logics plural. There is an underlying worldview.
Yeah.
And when we grasp that underlying worldview, we will be able to respond better. And even abortion, you mentioned that, among professional bioethicists today, they all agree that life begins at conception. Most of the public doesn't know that yet.
Yeah.
But professional bioethicists, and actually I got a lot of quotes from feminists as well in Love Thy Body, acknowledging that life begins at conception. And it's not just moving the goalpost. It is, in fact, the underlying worldview that says the body doesn't matter, because what they're saying is, as long as the fetus is biologically human, because they'll acknowledge that, right?
Yeah.
Genetically, DNA, chromosomally, physically, the fetus is human. That's what they're acknowledging now.
Yeah.
But what are they saying? They're saying it's just a body. It's just physical. Yeah. And as we saw with homosexuality, we saw with transgenderism, the current view is, who cares about the body? So as long as the fetus is seen as merely a physical organism, it can be killed for any reason or no reason. It can be used for, genetic experiments. Yep. It can be experimented with. It can be picked through for sellable body parts, as Planned Parenthood does, and then tossed out with the other medical waste. Yep. And that is how medical journals refer to it. They refer to the fetus as medical waste.
Yeah.
At some point, it acquires, it jumps into a new status and becomes a person. Of course, every bioethicist draws the line at a different place. But what they say is it's human to a certain point, and then it becomes a person. And then when it's a person, which is not physical, which is in terms of cognitive abilities and self-awareness and so on, then suddenly it has so much value that to kill it would be murder. Yeah. So there's a magical moment when it becomes more than a mere physical thing. In fact, that's exactly how one professor put it in the New York Times. He said, there's a magical moment at which a mere physical thing suddenly becomes a person with so much dignity that to kill it would be murder. But you see, it is the same denigration of the body. Yeah. It's the same low view of the material world. So once we realize that, then it won't be just a random moving of the goalpost. We'll say, oh, there's that worldview again.
Yeah.
And euthanasia, of course, is the same thing, because euthanasia says when you lose a certain level of cognitive function, again, personhood is purely mental. You lose a certain level of cognitive functioning, yeah, then you're only a body, as one bioethicist put it. Yeah. You're only a body.
It becomes a completely subjective standard to measure what counts as a human person. And it's no different than the eugenists in the early part of the 20th century who said, well, if somebody was non-European looking or had Africanized features, well, they don't count as fully human. So we rejected that historically, but we've come full circle. We can't, it's not, people were hoping to escape that by creating these new ideas, but we're ending up in the same place. We're just picking different features that we're evaluating who counts less and who counts more. But we end up in the same trap of dehumanizing.
Right, in our context today, it tends to be body and person.
Yeah,
it's not racial features, but
exactly
cognitive features. It is a new kind of eugenics based purely on cognitive features. Now, you talked about what do we do with our kids?
Yeah.
By the way, I read that post-millennial article too, and I know some of those parents.
Oh, good.
But in Love Thy Body, I do tell the story of a young boy who clearly had gender dysphoria from a very young age, and I called him Brandon. It's not his real name. But he was one of those kids who, before he was even walking, when he was still just crawling, his babysitter told his mom he's too good to be a boy, meaning he was quiet, compliant, sensitive, and the kind of things that we usually associate stereotypically with girls. When he was in preschool, when his mother picked him up, every day he was playing with the little girls and not the little boys. Mm. By elementary school, he was coming to his parents weeping and saying, I don't fit in anywhere. I'm not interested in things that boys are interested in. I'm interested in the things girls are interested in. I feel like a girl. I think like a girl. God should have made me a girl. By age 14, he was scouring the internet for information on sex change surgery. Yeah. By the way, he's now, 25 or so. So this was before transgender was a big thing, and yet they recognized it immediately. Mm. They knew when he was a toddler, they knew he was going to have a problem with this. And they made sure they never used the word transgender in his presence. They wanted to keep him away from it as long as possible. But what did they do? First of all, they made sure that he knew they loved him just the way he was. I have had friends who are homosexual, for example, who said, a friend of mine in seminary said, when I was young, I loved art and music. And my father was baffled and kept trying to push me into more traditionally masculine activities like sports.
Yeah.
Which didn't work. So Brandon's parents made sure that they didn't try to change him. They said it is perfectly okay for you to be a sensitive, gentle, emotional, relational boy.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you're really a girl. And they even took him, as he got older, they took him through things like the Myers-Briggs personality test, where they could show him boys can be at this end of the spectrum and boys can be at the other end of the spectrum. And of course, so can girls. So they kept, you know what their favorite line was? They kept telling him, it's not you that's wrong, it's the stereotypes that are wrong.
Yeah.
You know, the gifts of the Spirit are not divided by sex. You know, teaching and prophecy are not masculine, as we might expect. Mercy and service are not feminine. Scripture says God distributes them to individuals as he wishes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Here's how he put it. He decided that even surgery would not give him what he wanted. It would not make him a girl.
Yeah.
You know, every sex in your body is a male or female. There's a very nice TED talk by a cardiologist called "Every Cell Has Sex."
I've listened to that. Yeah, it's interesting.
And her point is, symptoms of heart attack are different for men and women, and so we need to study women to understand better their symptoms. But if you go to the YouTube site where the TED talk is, remember she's a cardiologist. Underneath it, are comments like, "Oh, she's so transphobic."
Yeah.
She never even talked about transgenderism. But the very fact that she affirms male-female binary for the purposes of medicine made people say, judge her as transphobic. And finally, by the way, there was one wise response that said, look, guys, she's not transphobic. She's just saying that whatever your gender philosophy may be, when you get sick and the doctors put you on the operating table, they need to know your original biological sex to give you the best medical care.
Have you read, I know in the UK, I think it was, I might get the surgery wrong, but there was a guy who sued and won because the doctors, he was biologically male, but had transitioned to female, but they wouldn't do like a hysterectomy or something like that with him. Like, he's like, we can't approve the surgery. Doesn't have the parts, but he actually won. And so I don't know what that meant. I'm not even sure how they were supposed to do it or what that really even practically meant, but it's just a sort of wild conflict between a worldview that denies a biological reality and the science of that with a political movement. And it creates these odd things like you're talking about. Just came to mind when you're talking about, like, that's jarring.
Yeah, so to make sure I answered your question about parents, I think the most important thing was his parents made sure he knew they loved him just the way he was. And he actually used part of my book, Total Truth. I have a chapter 12 in Total Truth on masculinity and femininity. They used that. They went through that with him.
Oh, okay.
And they made sure they were using positive language. When I speak to Christian audiences, I have found that this is really a difficult thing for Christians to get their mind around. How do they stop just saying it's wrong, it's sin, don't do it, and there's something wrong with you, to saying honor your body, affirm who God made you to be.
Yeah.
Respect your biological identity. One of my favorite stories in Love Thy Body it's in the chapter on homosexuality, and it's a young man named Sean who was same-sex attracted from the time he was quite young, exclusively. And today he's married and has 3 kids and teaches ethics, by the way. He's an ethics professor like you are, except he's in London. But the interesting thing about his story is that he was in a gay-affirming family and attended a gay-affirming church. Mm-hmm. So he was not driven by guilt or shame. Why did he change then? He said, I started to realize that I was not acknowledging the body that God had given me. Here's how he put it. I stopped identifying myself by my sexual feelings and started to identify with my body that God had given me. And he said, you can't really change your feelings directly. That rarely works. He said, but what I started to do was to affirm what I already had, which was a male body, as a gift from God. And eventually my feelings followed suit. And that is really what's at the heart of this debate. Do we live in a cosmos operating by blind material forces, and therefore our body is just a product of random material forces? Or is our body the product of a loving creator and a good creator, and therefore is intrinsically good? And that's the message that Christians need to get across, is that we are ultimately aiming to affirm the goodness of the body as God made it.
Yeah. That's really simple. I really like that. The way you phrase that, to try to talk to our kids first about, like, I think Christians too quickly, let's put it this way, jump into labeling stuff as sin or not sin and those sort of things. Not that those aren't related issues to what we're talking about, but I think more importantly, especially for a kid who's having questions or doubts or wondering or these feelings, there's real genuine psychological, emotional, sometimes practical issues at play here. And it's not about just, oh, you're wrong and it's evil and the way you're thinking is bad. We have to understand why sometimes this is happening, and approach them lovingly to say, look, God made you a special human being and he made you for a purpose. Let's find out why maybe that's not lining up for you between what your biological reality is and your emotional, spiritual, sexual identity is sort of telling you, and where those things are at. We have to be careful to address them on an individual basis. Again, not denying that there's such a thing as sin and, wrong and those sort of things, but I don't think that's the beginning place for that conversation in probably 99% of the cases, Is that fair to think? Do you think that's a decent way of looking at it?
Yeah, I'll give you one more short example. This was a woman named Jean who lived as a lesbian for many years, and I tell her story in my book. She said eventually, and today she's married and has 2 children, and she said the turning point came when I started to think, I realized that God had made me female for a reason. And I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
Honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design.
Yeah.
Now that's the message that we need to get to our kids, that it's about honoring your body, so that's a positive thing, and living in accord with the Creator's design, living in harmony with who God made us. We need to sort of practice using language like harmony and honor the body and self-integration, because when we talk about the alienation between the body and the person, I actually read a Princeton University professor wrote a philosophy book defending transgenderism, and in the process of defending it, she said it involves self-alienation, self-division, and I thought, so the Christian answer is self-integration. Harmony between the body and the person. That's our goal, is to bring harmony, honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. Yeah. And we need to actually practice that kind of language when we're talking to people.
Yeah, that's so great. And I think we'll have to end there because we're out of our time. Well, thank you, Professor Pearcey, for being here. It was a real blessing and good to finally talk to you after over the past few years of some other exchanges.
Good to talk with you as well, and thanks for having me.
There is so much more that we could say about transgender ideology and how it denies God's design. But for now, I want to encourage you to go out and till the soil of culture so that you can raise the roof on false identities and expose your friends and family to the beauty of God's good design for sex. I hope you'll come back and join me in the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.